The heat of Dust Haven pressed down like a weight, the kind that made a man's lungs ache just by breathing. The settlement was little more than splintered boards nailed into shacks, a saloon with broken shutters, and a platform at the center where the day's ugliest business was conducted. A crowd had gathered, restless and loud, eager to watch human lives bartered like cattle. Ethan Callahan moved through them in his long, dusty coat, each step measured, each glance casual but deliberate. He looked like a drifter, another man seeking a cheap solution to a lonely life. That was exactly how he wanted them to see him. The truth was buried beneath layers of scars and secrets, and today wasn't about truth. It was about baiting a trap. 12 women stood on the platform, their wrists bound with coarse rope. Their faces were downcast, their spirits beaten until they looked more like property than people. But the 13th woman was different. Heavy iron shackles bit into her wrists. Her back was straight, her dark eyes unflinching. Where the others looked away, she met Ethan's gaze head-on, as though daring him to acknowledge her. "That one," Ethan said, his voice low, but carrying in the silence that followed. He pointed directly at her. The crowd stilled. Someone dropped a bottle. It shattered against the dirt. Cyrus Harlow. The merchant in charge blinked at Ethan like he'd misheard. "Sir," he began slowly, "you don't want her. She's trouble. Won't speak, won't break. Killed 2 men when we took her in. You'd be better off with any of the others." Ethan didn't look at the other women. He set a worn leather pouch on Harlow's desk and spilled silver coins across the wood. They gleamed too brightly, too freshly minted for a place like Dust Haven. A ripple of unease passed through the onlookers. Men here were used to dirty trade, not clean money. "I said that one," Ethan repeated. Barrett Cole, Harlow's enforcer, shifted his weight, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip. His eyes swept Ethan's coat, his boots, the precise way he stacked the coins. Nothing about this man said drifter. Everything about him said dangerous. "Boss," Cole muttered, "maybe we ask where this fella's silver came from." Harlow licked his lips, suddenly unsure. 300, he said at last, testing. Triple the usual price. Ethan didn't haggle. He counted out every coin in neat piles, each metallic click loud in the tension-filled square. Then he reached into his vest and produced a small iron key, something no outsider should have. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he stepped toward the platform. The shackled woman never flinched. She only tilted her head, the faintest sign of recognition flickering in her eyes. Ethan slid the key into the lock. With a sharp metallic snap, the shackles fell away. And then she spoke. "You're too late," she said, her English clear and steady despite the weeks of silence. "They already know you're here." The words struck like a rifle shot. The crowd surged. Men reached for weapons. Cole's revolver cleared leather. Harlow's face drained of color. How did she know English? How did this stranger know her name? Naya? Ethan's expression didn't change. He only straightened, his hands loose at his sides, though the air around him felt charged, coiled, waiting. Dust Haven had just realized they weren't watching a purchase. They were watching the beginning of a reckoning. Gunmetal tension filled Dust Haven Square. Every man present had a hand near his weapon, but none dared draw first. The woman, Naya, stood beside Ethan Callahan, her raw wrists red from the shackles. The crowd's unease deepened. They had never heard her speak, much less in English, and now she spoke as if she knew this stranger's secrets. Cyrus Harlow broke the silence, his voice ragged. "What is this? Who the hell are you?" Ethan's smile was thin, humorless. Just a man buying what you're selling. Isn't that what this place is for? His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp, cutting across the crowd like blades. Barrett Cole, muscles coiled under his worn duster, took a step forward. His revolver glinted in the fading light. Boss, he's lying. Nobody carries fresh silver out here unless they've got backing. And that key, how in God's name did he get the key? The murmurs swelled into something darker. Suspicion, fear, the sense that the man in the dusty coat wasn't prey, but predator. Naya's gaze swept the rooftops, her expression grim. "They're already in position," she whispered. "Rifles! Look!" Ethan followed her eyes. Sure enough, shadows shifted above the saloon, the livery, even the church steeple. Rifle barrels glinted faintly. He had walked right into a net. Harlow's smile returned, but this time it was cruel. "Thought you could waltz in and take her? Thought we wouldn't see through you?" He spat into the dirt. "You're finished, Callahan." At the name, several men in the crowd stiffened. Recognition rippled through them. Ethan Callahan, the deserter, the survivor of Willow Creek, the man whispered about in army camps and outlaw circles alike. Some swore he was dead. Others swore he should be. "You should be rotting in a grave," Harlow hissed. "Colonel Morrison made sure of that." Naya's sharp intake of breath cut through the noise. Her father's murderer, her village's destroyer. That name was carved into her soul. Her eyes snapped to Ethan. "Morrison?" she demanded. "You know him?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, his hands dropped, slow and deliberate, to the butts of the twin Colts at his hips. "I know him," he said finally, voice flat. "And I know he sent you to finish what he couldn't." Cole drew first. Ethan moved faster. His revolver barked once, the shot tearing Cole's pistol clean from his hand, spinning it into the dust. Before Cole could even register the pain, Ethan's second gun fired, the bullet striking the ground inches from Harlow's boots. The crowd scattered in a panic, overturning barrels and sending up clouds of grit. Naya snatched a rifle from a stunned guard and cocked it with the confidence of a fighter who'd handled weapons all her life. "The storehouse," she said quickly. "The women, they're locked inside. 3 guards." Ethan's eyes never left Harlow, who clutched his desk with shaking hands. "Then we get them out," Ethan muttered. But Harlow's laugh was low, broken, triumphant. "You think it matters what you do here? Morrison owns this territory. He owns the law. And you, Callahan, you're already condemned. They'll hang you for Willow Creek before sunrise." From the rooftops, the metallic click of rifle bolts being chambered rang out, cold and final. Ethan glanced up and counted at least a dozen muzzles trained on him. Too many for one man, even with Naya at his side. She met his eyes, steady and defiant. "So what now?" Ethan holstered one Colt, kept the other steady. His smile was grim. "Now," he said, "we see if ghosts can still fight." The night wind swept through Dust Haven, carrying grit and the metallic scent of fear. Ethan Callahan stood exposed in the center of the square, Naya at his side, while rifles gleamed like wolf eyes from the rooftops. "Ethan Callahan!" a voice boomed from above, official and cold. "By order of the United States Army, you are under arrest for desertion, mutiny, and the massacre at Willow Creek. Lay down your arms." The words cut deeper than bullets. Men in the crowd muttered, some crossing themselves. Willow Creek. The name carried weight. Some believed the story, that Ethan had turned traitor, slaughtering his own unit and leaving the army in disgrace. Others whispered of something darker, Something covered up. Naya's eyes locked on him. "Massacre?" she hissed. "They burned my village. My father. My brothers. They called it justice. That was your army." Her words were knives, but Ethan didn't flinch. "I was there," he said softly, never looking away from the muzzles above. "I saw Morrison give the order. I refused it. My men refused it. And for that, they butchered us." Naya's breath caught. "But you survived." "Barely. Buried under bodies. Left to die while Morrison wrote the report that made him a hero." The soldiers above shifted. 12 rifles held steady, waiting for the signal to fire. Cyrus Harlow, clutching his bleeding wrist, grinned through the pain. "You hear that, folks? He admits it. Traitor to his own flag. Don't matter what excuses he gives." But then the wind carried another sound. Sharp cracks, echoing from the outskirts. Gunfire, not from the rooftops, from beyond. Shadows flared into muzzle flashes at the settlement's edge. One rooftop rifleman cried out and toppled into the dirt. Another fell back with a scream. The square erupted. From behind the water tower, Sergeant Tommy Whitmore's voice rang out like thunder. "Still think he's alone, Cyrus?" Another volley answered. More rooftop shooters crumpled under precise fire. Naya's head snapped toward the voices. She saw them. Shapes moving with soldiers' discipline, cutting down Morrison's ambush with deadly efficiency. Ethan's ghosts. The survivors of Willow Creek. Whitmore ducked behind the trough, reloading. "Told you we'd come, Captain." His grin flashed wolfish in the dark. "Figured you'd find trouble sooner than later." Ethan exhaled once, steady, then drew both Colts in a blur. "Guess I'm still predictable." Naya leveled her rifle and fired, her shot dropping a rooftop gunman who had sighted Ethan's chest. Her hands were steady, her face carved from stone. In that moment, Ethan knew she wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter with cause. Chaos reigned. The townsfolk scattered like frightened cattle as bullets chewed through signs and shattered windows. Monroe's enforcers bolted for cover, but Ethan and his men cut them off with a wall of lead. Cyrus Harlow, pale and trembling, tried to crawl toward the saloon. Ethan's voice cracked across the square. "Stay where you are, Cyrus. You'll answer for this." But Harlow only laughed, spitting blood. "You'll never escape Morrison. He's got the government in his pocket. He'll bury you twice, Callahan. Once in the ground, once in the record books." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the sound of fresh horses thundered on the horizon. Naya's face blanched. "That's not Harlow's men." Ethan didn't need to ask who. He already knew. Morrison was coming, and this time he was bringing an army. Dawn broke red over Dust Haven. The sky streaked like fresh blood. Smoke curled from shattered windows, and the stench of gunpowder hung thick in the air. Ethan Callahan stood in the ruined square, his Colts reloaded, his men regrouping in the shadows. Naya stayed close, rifle clutched tight, her jaw set like stone. The sound of hooves rolled in from the east, heavy, disciplined, too steady for outlaws. A column of blue uniforms emerged through the morning haze. At their head rode a man Ethan hadn't seen in years, but could never forget. Colonel William Morrison. He sat his horse with practiced authority, his coat immaculate, medals gleaming in the sunrise. The picture of honor, except Ethan knew every one of those decorations was paid for in lies and blood. "Maddox," Morrison's voice cracked across the square, rich with command. "Or should I say Callahan, the deserter who butchered his own men at Willow Creek? You should have stayed buried." The townsfolk who hadn't fled huddled in doorways, whispering the colonel's name like a curse and a prayer at once. Soldiers fanned out behind him, rifles raised, eyes wary. Ethan stepped forward into the open. "You murdered them, Morrison. Not me. You slaughtered women and children to cover your theft. And when my men refused to follow your order, you cut them down." Morrison's face hardened, but his voice carried with practiced ease. "More lies from a coward. You abandoned your command, betrayed your oath, and now you consort with savages to finish your treachery." Naya emerged from behind the cart, her rifle trained steady on Morrison. Her voice rang clear, strong enough for the soldiers to hear. "He's the one who burned my village, killed my father, took our women, all so he could keep his crimes hidden." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Some soldiers shifted uneasily, lowering their rifles an inch. Morrison's smile faltered. "Silence her," he snapped. But none moved. Ethan raised his voice, louder now, meant for the men in blue. "Ask him about the Confederate gold, the shipment that never reached Richmond. Ask him why every man who could expose the truth ended up dead." That pierced the line. A sergeant near the front frowned, whispering to the man beside him. Morrison's hand twitched toward his revolver, but Ethan was faster. His Colt's cleared leather with the same deadly grace that had carried him through battlefields and backwater saloons. The square froze. Two gunfighters, 10 paces apart. Morrison's voice dropped low, venomous. "I should have finished you at Willow Creek." "You tried," Ethan said, "but I wasn't alone then, and I'm not alone now." From the rooftops, Sergeant Whitmore's rifle cracked. A warning shot slammed into the dirt at Morrison's horse's hooves. Soldiers jerked, startled. The colonel's eyes widened as more of Ethan's surviving unit revealed themselves, hidden on rooftops, in alleys, rifles trained with military precision. For the first time, Morrison looked unsure. Ethan didn't press. He didn't need to. The truth was already unraveling Morrison's command. Every second his men hesitated, his authority slipped further away. Then Naya's voice carried like a bell. At Willow Creek, he murdered innocents to hide his theft. Today, you can stop following orders built on blood. Silence stretched, taut as a hanging rope. Then Sergeant Reynolds lowered his rifle. Slowly, deliberately. One by one, others followed. Morrison saw his grip shatter. His face twisted with rage. With a snarl, he drew. But Ethan was quicker. One shot rang out. Morrison's revolver spun from his hand, clattering across the dirt. He reeled in the saddle, clutching his bleeding wrist. The colonel's medals glittered in the rising sun, stained now with his own blood. "You'll hang for what you did," Ethan said coldly. Morrison spat into the dust. "You think you've won? You haven't even started." And from the far ridge, more horsemen appeared, dust clouds rising, reinforcements. The fight was far from over. The square of Dust Haven was charged with silence after Ethan's bullet tore Morrison's pistol from his hand. The colonel's bloodied wrist dripped scarlet onto his immaculate coat, but his sneer never faltered. Behind him, the thunder of fresh riders rolled in, carrying banners of authority twisted into corruption. Morrison barked at his wavering soldiers. "Stand fast! That's an order!" But their rifles shook in uncertain hands. Sergeant Reynolds stared at his colonel, then at the documents Naya had shown, still clutched in his memory from hours before. Doubt was spreading like fire through dry grass. Ethan knew hesitation wouldn't last. Reinforcements would soon tilt the balance. He leaned close to Naya, his voice low. "We need to get those women out now. Once Morrison rallies, this town becomes a slaughterhouse." Naya nodded, eyes blazing. "The storehouse. Follow me." Gunfire cracked from the rooftops as Sergeant Whitmore's men laid covering fire, buying precious seconds. Bullets sparked off the water trough where Ethan and Naya ducked. Civilians scrambled for cover, their fear blending with the smell of dust and blood. Ethan fired twice, not to kill, but to scatter Morrison's loyalists. The soldiers faltered, torn between obedience and the gnawing suspicion their colonel was rotten. Inside the storehouse, the air was thick with despair. 17 women, Comanche, Mexican, Kiowa, even settlers, looked up when the door burst open. Shackles clanked as they shifted in fear. But Naya's voice rang out strong in 3 tongues. "You're free. Take heart. We fight for you now." Hope flickered in weary eyes. Ethan shot the padlock off the supply chest, pulling rifles and pistols from the stash his men had hidden days earlier. He pressed weapons into trembling hands. "Can you fight?" A young Kiowa woman lifted a rifle with steady grip. "We can!" Outside, the thunder grew louder. Morrison's reinforcements, 24 riders in government blue, charged down the main street, sabers flashing, carbines ready. Dusthaven trembled under their advance. Whitmore's men opened fire, precise and disciplined. 2 riders fell, horses screaming, but the rest pressed forward. The square erupted in chaos. Ethan shoved the last freed woman toward the rear alley. "Go! Stay low!" He and Naya took the rear guard, covering their escape with every bullet they had. Morrison, clutching his bleeding hand, screamed over the din. "Cut them down! No one leaves alive!" His voice cracked with fury, but it could not mask the fear in his eyes. Naya's rifle barked, dropping a cavalryman from his saddle. She reloaded fast, her movement smooth as any seasoned soldier. Ethan covered her flank, his Colts spitting fire. The two moved in perfect rhythm, a dance of survival forged by necessity. The freed women dashed through the alleys, guided by Whitmore's men toward the stables where fresh horses waited. Ethan and Naya fought a retreat, every step costly. Bullets tore splinters from the walls around them, the hiss of lead inches from their skin. Then the trap tightened. A squad of Morrison's reinforcements flanked the alley, cutting off their escape. Rifles leveled, bayonets glinting. Ethan's heart clenched. Too many. No cover. He stepped forward, ready to sell his life dearly. But before the soldiers fired, Sergeant Reynolds appeared at their flank, rifle raised, not at Ethan, but at his own men. "Stand down!" he roared. His voice cracked with command and conviction. "This man tells the truth. Morrison's crimes are real. You fire on them. You fire on justice itself." The soldiers froze, torn, loyalty wavered, and in that moment, Ethan acted. He hurled a smoke bomb from his belt, one of Whitmore's tricks from the war. The alley filled with choking haze. Shots went wild. Confusion reigned. "Move!" Ethan shouted. He seized Naya's hand, pulling her through the gray shroud. They broke into the open street, where Whitmore waited with fresh mounts. Naya swung into the saddle with practiced ease, helping others mount behind her. Ethan vaulted onto his own horse, Colts blazing one last time to keep Morrison's men pinned. The war cry of freedom rang as the ragged convoy thundered out of Dusthaven. 17 rescued women, Ethan's surviving unit, and 2 outlaws of fate riding at their head. Behind them, Morrison bellowed in fury, his voice drowned by the pounding hooves. Dusthaven receded, but the battle was far from finished. Morrison still lived, and men like him never stopped until buried deep in the ground. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The ride from Dusthaven stretched into the cold hours of night. Horses steamed under the strain, and the rescued women clung tight to their mounts as Ethan and his men pushed them north toward safety. The moon lit the desert in silver, turning every cactus and rock into ghostly silhouettes. Behind them, the town smoldered like a scar on the horizon. By dawn, they reached a canyon where Whitmore's men had stockpiled food and water. Exhausted, the women collapsed in the shade, some weeping silently, others sitting stiff and hollow-eyed. Naya moved among them, her presence steady and commanding. She spoke in Comanche, then Spanish, then English, soothing, organizing, binding the broken pieces into something resembling strength. Ethan watched her, a question burning in his chest. She had carried herself with such fire, such certainty in the middle of chaos. Now he saw the toll it took, her shoulders sagging when she thought no one looked, her hands trembling when she unwrapped a bloodied bandage. She wasn't made of stone. She was human, and she carried grief like a wound that never healed. Whitmore joined Ethan at the canyon's edge, scanning the trail. "They'll come for us," he muttered. "Morrison won't let this stand. Men like him. They can't." Ethan nodded grimly. "That's why we can't just run. We need the world to see what he's done. Otherwise, these women," he gestured to the huddled survivors, "remain ghosts no one believes in." Naya overheard, stepping closer. "The law ignored us before. Why would it listen now?" Ethan pulled a small packet from his coat, documents stained and worn but legible. "Because I've got more than testimony. When Morrison betrayed my unit, I took records, payment slips, orders signed with his own hand. Your father hid them for me, after Willow Creek. They're the one thing he couldn't burn." Naya's eyes narrowed. "And you plan to use them?" "Yes," Ethan said firmly. "In Denver, federal court. If the people hear the truth under oath, Morrison won't just lose his command. He'll lose his freedom, maybe his life." Whitmore spat into the dust. "If we live long enough to get there." That night, as campfires flickered against the canyon walls, Ethan's men debated. Some wanted to scatter, vanish into the frontier. Others argued for taking Morrison's life outright. Swift revenge instead of uncertain justice. Ethan stood, his shadow stretching long. Killing Morrison makes him a martyr. Dragging him into court makes him a criminal. Every woman here deserves to stand and tell the world what was done to her. Every soldier he betrayed deserves to see him shackled. We fight not for vengeance, but for truth. The silence that followed was heavy, but slowly heads nodded. Even the most hardened survivors understood the weight of that choice. Naya spoke last. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "My father believed mercy was strength. I am not my father. But for the sake of these women, I will stand beside you in Denver. Let the law see what we have seen." The decision was made. They would ride for Denver, carrying their evidence, their scars, and their fragile hope. But as the stars wheeled overhead, Ethan lay awake, listening to the distant echo of hooves in his memory. He knew Morrison wouldn't wait for court. Somewhere out there, the colonel was already gathering his allies, sharpening lies sharper than any blade. The coming fight would not just be about bullets. It would be about truth itself, and whether the frontier had room for it. The courthouse in Denver stood like a fortress of stone, its tall columns casting long shadows across the square. For most, it was just another building in a growing city. But for Ethan, Maddox, and Naya, it was the line between silence and justice. Inside, the air was thick with expectation. Journalists filled the benches, their pencils poised to capture every word. Local townsfolk had crowded in too, curious to see whether the law would truly take on one of its own. And at the center of it all sat Colonel James Morrison, dressed in full uniform, his medals gleaming like false suns. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man convinced the world owed him its loyalty. Ethan entered flanked by Whitmore and Hayes, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. The rescued women followed, veils covering their faces, their dignity intact despite all they had suffered. When Naya stepped forward, heads turned. She carried herself not as a victim, but as a witness, armed with truth, sharper than any blade. The judge, an older man with deep lines carved by decades of service, struck his gavel. This court will hear the charges against Colonel Morrison: conspiracy, murder, treason, and crimes against the people of the frontier. The prosecutor rose, presenting the documents Ethan had carried since Willow Creek. Each page bore Morrison's signature: orders to fire on unarmed villages, payments received from Confederate agents, ledgers of missing gold. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the evidence mounted. When the witnesses were called, Naya took the stand first. She spoke in English, then in Comanche, then in Spanish, her words clear and unflinching. She described the raid on her village, the fires, the screams, the soldiers who tore families apart. She spoke of the women stolen, the children slain, and her father's final act of mercy in saving a wounded soldier, Ethan Maddox. Morrison's lawyer objected, sneering that her testimony was colored by grief and revenge. But the judge allowed her words to stand. Her voice never faltered, and when she finished, the room was silent. Next came Ethan. He recounted Willow Creek, the refusal to fire, the betrayal that followed, the slaughter of his men. His words were plain, but they carried the weight of memory carved in blood. At one point, Morrison rose from his seat, shouting, "Lies! They were deserters, cowards!" The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Sit down, Colonel. You'll have your chance." When Monroe, shackled and gaunt, was brought to testify, the tension broke wide open. His voice dripped with spite, but his confession was undeniable. He described the trafficking ring, the payments Morrison collected, the deals with Washington politicians who looked the other way. He admitted to burying women in shallow graves when they resisted. His words turned the courtroom air bitter. By the time the closing arguments were made, the weight of evidence felt crushing. The jury deliberated less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. "Guilty on all counts." Morrison's face twisted, his pride shattered. Soldiers who once saluted him now stepped forward to shackle his wrists. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Others wept. Ethan looked at Naya. For the first time since Willow Creek, he felt the iron weight of betrayal ease from his chest. But as they left the courthouse, Whitmore leaned close. "This isn't over. Morrison had partners. Men in Washington won't let this stand. Today, we won a battle. The war's still coming." Outside, the bells of Denver rang noon, their sound carrying across the wide frontier. For Ethan and Naya, it was a victory, but also a beginning. Justice had spoken, but justice demanded guardians. 6 months later, Denver was alive with spring. The snows had melted from the peaks, and the streets buzzed with wagons, traders, and fortune seekers chasing rumors of silver in the mountains. For most, it was just another season of change. For Ethan Maddox, it was the first time in years that change felt like hope instead of loss. He stood on the courthouse steps, watching as Cyrus Monroe was loaded into a prison wagon, bound for Fort Leavenworth. Shackled and broken, Monroe no longer looked like the swaggering merchant who had run his empire of suffering. Behind him shuffled 6 officers in tarnished uniforms, convicted of corruption alongside their colonel. The gavel had spoken, and the system, flawed as it was, had delivered justice. Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat, the wind carrying with it the faint chime of church bells. He had thought this moment would bring peace, but peace, he realized, was never permanent on the frontier. Naya emerged from the courthouse, a satchel of documents pressed to her chest. Her dark hair was braided neatly, her chin easily lifted with quiet pride. Over the last months, she had become more than a witness. She had become a voice for the voiceless. Her testimony had set precedent. Her leadership had turned survivors into advocates. The judge himself had called her the conscience of this court. "They're gone," she said softly, nodding toward the prison wagon as it rolled out of sight. "For now," Ethan replied. "But Monroe wasn't wrong. There are others. Washington may have buried Morrison, but men like him cast long shadows." Naya studied him for a long moment, then reached into her satchel. She pulled out a folded letter, its wax seal broken. "You've been carrying this for weeks. Are you going to tell me what it says, or do I have to guess?" Ethan chuckled, though there was no humor in it. He unfolded the letter, letting her read the bold script of the New Mexico governor. Territorial Marshal, a position that would give him authority across hundreds of miles, the power to hunt down the remnants of Morrison's network, and the responsibility to protect settlements too far from Washington's reach. "They're offering you a badge," Naya said, her voice thoughtful. "Not just me." Ethan handed her the second page. "It says I can choose my deputy." Her eyes scanned the words, then lifted to meet his. "A marshal and his deputy," she murmured. "Sounds like something out of a dime novel." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but this isn't a story, Naya. It's real. And the frontier doesn't need novels. It needs justice." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then she smiled, small but certain. "If you're asking, my answer is yes. Someone has to make sure you don't get yourself killed." Ethan laughed, the sound surprising even himself. He offered his hand. She took it, firm and steady, the gesture carrying more weight than any vow spoken in court. That evening, they rode out together. Denver's lights faded behind them, replaced by the wide expanse of plains and mountains. The sky turned to fire as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with promise. Ethan carried the badge in his pocket, its metal cool against his palm. Ahead lay towns where lawmen had been bought, villages still haunted by raiders, families clinging to hope in a land that often gave none. It was a vast, dangerous territory, but for the first time, Ethan felt he wasn't walking into it alone. Beside him, Naya rode tall in the saddle, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She wasn't a captive anymore, nor just a witness to someone else's war. She was his partner, his equal, bound not by chains, but by choice. As night fell and the stars blinked awake, Ethan touched the badge again and whispered, "This time, we make it right." And with that, the marshal and his deputy began their long ride into legend.